Put that beast on a leash or I'm calling animal control. Karen, he's literally sitting. I don't care, he looked at me. That's how my peaceful Sunday walk turned into the loudest HOA meltdown this side of suburbia. Smash that like button if you've ever dealt with someone who thinks the sidewalk is their private kingdom. Subscribe for more stories where karma wears a badge and drives a squad car. Get comfy, because this particular Karen was about to learn that calling animal control on a retired K9 handler's dog is the worst mistake she's ever made. When I first moved into Maple Ridge Estates, I thought I had found the kind of neighborhood where people smiled at you from their porches and waved as you passed by. It looked like the kind of place where the biggest problem anyone ever had was forgetting trash day or mowing the lawn too short. The houses all looked the same, each with perfectly trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes that gleamed like trophies for conformity. It was the kind of neighborhood that took pride in its silence, where even the birds seemed to sing in a polite whisper. After 15 years on the police force, I wanted quiet more than anything. I wanted mornings that started with a strong cup of coffee and the sound of my old partner's paws padding across the kitchen floor. Max wasn't just any dog. He had been my K9 partner for 7 years before retiring after an injury. He was a German shepherd with a coat like burnished gold and eyes that carried a kind of steady wisdom I'd never seen in another animal. He wasn't just trained, he was disciplined, calm, and impossibly loyal. When I decided to buy the house, I imagined he'd finally get to relax. No more sirens, no more late-night calls, no more tension in the air that came from the job, just peace. That illusion lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, I was out in the front yard letting Max sniff around the flower beds when I first heard the sharp clip of heels on pavement. A woman was approaching from the end of the street, walking with the determination of someone who had already made up her mind about everything. She wore a pink sun visor, large sunglasses that looked like they belonged in a 1982nd soap opera, and a pastel tracksuit so bright it could probably be seen from space. In one hand she carried a clipboard, and in the other, a phone already set to camera mode. She didn't greet me, she didn't smile. She stopped at the edge of my property and looked at Max like he was an armed intruder. Her tone was sharp enough to slice through the morning air. "That dog better be leashed," she said. I explained that he was a trained service animal, retired now, perfectly behaved, and that we were just standing in my front yard, but she didn't seem interested in conversation. She crouched slightly and snapped a photo of him before scribbling something on her clipboard. It was such an odd moment that I actually laughed. I thought maybe she was the neighborhood dog catcher, or just someone with too much caffeine and not enough hobbies. I asked if she was with the HOA, and that was when I saw the shift in her expression, the way her chin lifted like she'd been waiting her whole life to be asked that question. She told me she was the vice president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, as if the title alone came with divine authority. Then she launched into a speech about community standards, approved pet sizes, leash ordinances, and the importance of maintaining property values. Max sat quietly beside me the entire time, head tilted, as if trying to understand why this stranger was raising her voice at him. When I assured her he had all his permits, medical records, and obedience certifications, she responded by asking if I could provide documentation proving he wasn't a high-risk breed. I had spent my career working with police dogs, so hearing someone call my partner dangerous because of his appearance stirred something in me. I told her politely that Max had served the city, saved lives, and probably had more discipline than most people. She pursed her lips and said that discipline doesn't make noise less disruptive. I realized then that this wasn't about noise or rules, it was about control. The kind of control that thrives on finding problems in perfection. When she finally walked away, she made a show of glancing at my mailbox, jotting something else down, and muttering that she'd make note of this interaction. That evening, I took Max for a walk around the neighborhood. A few people waved, but others gave quick glances before looking away, as if they'd already heard something about me. I could feel the quiet disapproval hanging in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Max didn't notice. He trotted beside me happily, tail swaying, oblivious to the politics of manicured lawns. It was strange, watching him enjoy what I had dreamed would be our peaceful retirement, knowing that someone nearby was already preparing a storm. I told myself it was harmless, that every neighborhood had its gossip and busybodies, but deep down I could sense it. Karen, though I didn't yet know her, name wasn't done with us. That first encounter wasn't an introduction, it was a warning. It started with a yellow slip of paper, stuck to my door like a scarlet letter for homeowners. The words "violation notice" were printed in bold letters across the top, followed by a paragraph accusing me of disturbing the neighborhood peace through unregulated animal activity. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Max had barely barked since we moved in. He was 12 years old and preferred sleeping on his blanket to causing trouble. I stood there on my porch rereading the notice while he looked up at me, tail thumping gently, as if asking whether we were going on another walk. I crumpled the paper in my hand and told him not to worry, but I could already feel the tension creeping into my chest. By the next morning, another notice appeared. This time it was about excessive noise at night. I hadn't even been home the night before. I'd spent it working late at the station, helping a friend run through reports for a charity fundraiser. I checked the timestamps on the supposed incident and shook my head. Whoever was writing these things wasn't just mistaken, they were fabricating. The language was formal, full of legal phrasing that sounded borrowed from someone who had practiced saying bylaw enforcement in the mirror. I didn't need to guess who it was. There was only one person in Maple Ridge Estates who clutched a clipboard like it was a badge. Karen's campaign escalated faster than I could keep up with it. Within a week, I had received 4 separate warnings. One accused Max of chasing neighborhood children, though the only time he had left the yard was when we jogged together at dawn. Another accused me of failing to maintain appropriate waste management standards, which apparently referred to a single leaf bag I'd left by the curb for pickup. Each notice was signed in the same jagged handwriting. I imagined her sitting at her kitchen table, glasses perched at the end of her nose, drafting letters like a self-appointed detective gathering evidence for a crime that didn't exist. It would have been funny if it weren't so intrusive. I'd worked with actual criminals who showed more restraint than this woman. Neighbors started keeping their distance, probably unsure whether I was the troublemaker she made me out to be. Conversations that used to start with small talk now ended quickly, eyes darting toward her house, as if she might appear from behind the blinds at any moment. Even the mailman avoided eye contact, probably tired of being caught in the crossfire of her endless reports. Then came the knock on my door from the HOA representative, a man named Phil, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He explained in a weary tone that the board had received multiple complaints and was obligated to conduct a preliminary inspection to verify them. When I asked if the complaints were from the same person, he hesitated before admitting that, yes, all of them originated from one resident. He didn't need to say her name. I invited him in, offered him coffee, and let Max sit politely at his side like a furry defense attorney. Within minutes, Phil was shaking his head and apologizing. He said it was clear that none of the complaints were valid, that Max was one of the most well-behaved dogs he'd ever met, and that he would close the case immediately. Still, the damage had been done. Once someone in a neighborhood starts spreading rumors, it doesn't matter how many times the truth is proven. The whispers don't stop. People start wondering whether maybe there's some part of the story they don't know, and Karen knew exactly how to feed that uncertainty. I began seeing her more often, walking her tiny poodle near my driveway at precise times, phone held up as if recording evidence. She'd smile, a sharp little smile, whenever our eyes met, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. I could have confronted her, but years on the force had taught me that people like Karen feed on confrontation. So, I documented instead, photos of the notices, dates and times of her inspections, a record of Max's quiet routines. I wasn't angry yet, I was patient. That's something police work teaches you, the importance of waiting until the right moment. When the 4th false complaint arrived, claiming that Max had lunged aggressively at her while she was jogging, I finally decided to reach out to someone who could put this nonsense to rest. Ryan Cole had been my partner back when Max was still working. He had since moved up the ranks to head the regional K9 unit. Ryan was a good man, practical, with a mischievous streak that came out when someone messed with his friends. I sent him a message explaining the situation, attached a few photos of the notices, and asked if he'd ever heard of an HOA enforcing fake animal codes. He responded almost instantly, "You let me handle this." I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew the tone of that message. It was the same tone we used to have before setting up a sting operation, the quiet promise that justice, real justice, was on its way. That night, I sat on the porch with Max, watching the sun set over rows of perfect lawns and silent houses. The air was calm, but I could feel the storm brewing behind every shuttered window. Karen had started something she wasn't prepared to finish. Saturday morning began with sunlight streaming through the kitchen blinds and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the room. For the first time all week, I felt calm. Max was curled up on his blanket, snoring softly, and the world seemed peaceful again. That calm lasted exactly 9 minutes before a loud, insistent knock rattled the front door. It wasn't the kind of polite knock you give a neighbor. It was the kind that comes from someone convinced they're serving justice. Max lifted his head, ears perked, and let out a single low growl. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed animal control officers stood there, clipboards in hand, wearing the slightly uncomfortable expressions of people who already suspected they were wasting their time. The taller of the 2 introduced himself as Officer Lang. He spoke in the cautious tone of someone who had already heard too many strange stories for one morning. They said they had received multiple reports of a dangerous dog in the neighborhood, possibly aggressive and unrestrained. I could tell by the way they avoided looking me in the eye that they had already been briefed by their most concerned citizen. I didn't even need to ask who had called. Karen's voice carried a very specific kind of urgency that stuck in your head like a mosquito's whine. Max stood quietly behind me, tail wagging in slow, patient rhythm. His ears twitched every time one of the officers shifted, but he never barked or moved. I explained that he was a retired service animal, fully trained and certified, and that he hadn't so much as chased a squirrel since we moved in. I invited them inside to see for themselves. The younger officer hesitated, clearly uncertain whether it was appropriate, but Lang nodded and stepped through the doorway. Max rose slowly, stretched, and walked up to him, sniffing politely before sitting down and offering his paw. The transformation on Lang's face was immediate. His whole posture relaxed. He crouched to pet Max's head and asked, almost jokingly, if this was the aggressive animal they'd been warned about. When I showed them Max's retirement documents, his medical records, and the framed certificate from his police service, both officers exchanged a look that could only be described as embarrassment. It turned out they'd been called out to the same address 6 times that week, each time finding nothing wrong. Each report described a vicious, uncontrolled beast terrorizing residents. They both knew it was false, but procedure required them to check. One of them glanced toward the street and sighed. "She's the one with the pink visor, right?" he asked. I nodded. The officer shared a look of resigned familiarity that told me Karen's reputation extended beyond our neighborhood. Apparently, she had filed complaints about barking birds, threatening squirrels, and a suspicious raccoon that had turned out to be a lawn ornament. I thanked them for their patience and offered coffee, but they declined, saying they had another call to handle. Before they left, Lang turned back and said quietly, "If she keeps this up, let us know. Harassment through false reports is a real thing. You've got rights too." After they drove off, I watched from the window as Karen appeared from behind her hedge with her phone raised. She wasn't even pretending to be discreet anymore. Her camera followed the animal control van as it turned the corner, then panned toward my house. I saw her mouthing words I couldn't hear, but her expression said everything. She looked satisfied, like she believed she had won something. It was the look of someone who needed conflict to feel alive. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, and stared at Max. He had already gone back to sleep, head resting on his paws, unbothered by the chaos outside. There was a strange kind of wisdom in his calm. He didn't take her actions personally, didn't dwell on the noise. He trusted that I would handle it, and somehow that faith made me more determined. I wasn't going to let this continue. Karen had crossed from annoyance into obsession, and it was time to remind her that actions have consequences. That afternoon, I called Ryan. I told him about the animal control visit, about the fabricated reports, about the way Karen stood in her yard filming my house like she was documenting a crime scene. He listened quietly, then laughed once, low and deliberate. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I've got an idea." I could hear the smile in his voice, the same one that always appeared when justice was about to take an unexpected turn. That night, I walked Max under the streetlights, the 2 of us moving through the quiet neighborhood that had become a stage for one woman's crusade. The air was cool, and the sky was clear enough to see stars scattered across it. For a moment, it was easy to forget the nonsense, to remember why I'd moved here in the first place. When we passed Karen's house, I saw her curtains twitch, just once, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. She thought she had control of the situation. She thought she could scare us into leaving. But she was about to learn that some people have friends in high places, and sometimes karma wears a badge and drives a truck full of canine seconds. 2 days after the animal control visit, the neighborhood woke to a sound it had never heard before. It started as a low hum in the distance, the kind that makes curtains tremble and coffee cups vibrate on the counter. I was sitting on my porch with Max, enjoying the rare quiet of early morning, when the hum grew into a rumble and then into a chorus of engines turning down our street. One by one, patrol trucks began to appear, each bearing the same bold lettering on the side, K9 Unit. I didn't even need to guess who was behind it. Ryan had said he had an idea, and knowing him, that meant something theatrical, something that would leave a lasting impression. The first truck stopped in front of my driveway, and Ryan stepped out wearing his usual grin, the one that always appeared right before he did something outrageous. He called out my name, waved, and then crouched down to greet Max like they were old war buddies, which, in a way, they were. Behind him, more handlers climbed out of their vehicles, and one by one, the doors opened to reveal dogs of every size and color. Shepherds, labs, Malinois, even a few bloodhounds. Dozens of them, each one disciplined, alert, and ready. It was a sight that would have made any dog lover tear up, but I knew it would make one particular person on the street break into a cold sweat. Neighbors started peeking out of their windows. Curtains twitched, garage doors lifted a few inches, and the familiar sound of phones recording filled the air. Within minutes, half the cul-de-sac was outside, standing on their lawns, trying to understand why the quietest street in the county had turned into a police dog convention. Ryan stood in the middle of the road, hands on his hips, surveying the scene like a director, about to call action. "Community K9 Awareness Day," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the street. "Educational outreach, courtesy of the county." The words were barely out of his mouth when Karen's door flew open. She came storming out in a pink robe and slippers, hair in rollers, her phone already recording as she marched down her walkway. Her voice carried the shrill tone of someone who believed yelling louder meant they were in charge. She demanded to know what was happening, why there were police vehicles blocking her street, and who authorized such a disturbance. Ryan smiled politely and introduced himself, explaining that they were conducting a community demonstration to educate residents on police dog safety and responsible ownership. Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Then she pointed at me. "This is harassment," she said. "This man has been terrorizing me, and now he's bringing in reinforcements." Ryan's expression didn't change. He gestured toward the nearest group of handlers and told her that the demonstration had been scheduled in response to recent neighborhood concerns about animal safety. "We just want to show everyone how well trained these dogs really are," he said. "It's important for the community to understand what responsible ownership looks like." As if on cue, the handlers lined up their dogs in formation along the street. At Ryan's signal, every one of them sat in perfect unison. The sound of synchronized obedience filled the air, a soft thump of paws against pavement followed by silence. It was beautiful, almost ceremonial. Karen stood frozen, clutching her phone, unsure whether to keep shouting or start running. The demonstration began, with officers explaining commands, safety tips, and the importance of socialization for working dogs. The animals performed flawlessly, responding instantly to their handlers, walking heel to heel, and sitting at attention. Ryan even invited a few children from the crowd to come forward and meet the dogs. Their laughter filled the air, pure and genuine, and for the first time in weeks, the street felt like a real neighborhood again. I stood near the edge of my driveway, Max sitting proudly beside me, tail swaying slowly as if he understood what was happening. He looked like he was back on duty, surveying his unit. Every time a handler called out a command, his ears twitched in recognition. It felt like old times, except this time, the mission wasn't catching criminals. It was teaching someone that not every noise, bark, or shadow was a threat. Karen tried one last time to regain control, muttering about calling the HOA, but even her usual audience wasn't listening. The neighbors who had once whispered about me were now clapping and smiling, taking pictures of the dogs, and thanking the officers for visiting. Ryan finished the demonstration with a short speech about community unity and mutual respect. His tone was calm, almost playful, but there was a glint in his eyes that said he knew exactly what he was doing. When the trucks finally rolled away, the street was filled with cheerful chatter. Karen stood on her lawn, jaw tight, as people congratulated me on having such well-trained dogs visit our neighborhood. Ryan gave me a nod before getting into his truck. "Consider it a public service," he said. "Sometimes the best way to silence barking is to drown it out with the sound of 100 others." Max let out a quiet bark, and I could have sworn he was laughing. When the last police truck disappeared down the street, the neighborhood felt different. The air carried that pleasant hum of conversation that happens after a community barbecue or a fireworks show. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me since I moved in were now waving and smiling, holding their kids by the hand as they walked past to thank me for hosting the most exciting morning in Maple Ridge history. Max sat by my feet, tongue hanging out, basking in the affection like the star of the show he had quietly been all along. For the first time since I unpacked my boxes, I felt like I actually belonged here. Across the street, though, Karen stood frozen in her front yard, still gripping her phone. Her robe was crooked, her hair in wild disarray, and she had the expression of someone who had just realized the battle she started had turned into a parade she couldn't stop. She kept glancing around, looking for someone to agree with her outrage, but every person she had once controlled with gossip and fear was now smiling at the dogs or chatting about how impressive the demonstration had been. Her authority had evaporated in the sunshine, and she didn't know how to function without it. I watched her retreat toward her house, muttering to herself, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had spent weeks filing false reports, photographing my home, and spreading lies about a retired service dog who had done nothing but nap and guard my peace. Her obsession had turned her into a neighborhood legend for all the wrong reasons, and now everyone knew exactly what kind of person she was. It was strange how quickly power shifted when the truth became undeniable. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on my porch with a cold drink when the HOA president, a woman named Denise, walked up my driveway. She was composed and professional, but her tone carried an undercurrent of embarrassment. She apologized on behalf of the association, explaining that they had been unaware of how far Karen's behavior had gone. She told me that multiple residents had filed complaints against her following the incident, accusing her of harassment, false reporting, and misuse of authority. Karen's community enforcement privileges, as she called them, had been suspended indefinitely. Denise assured me that formal action was being taken and that I would receive written confirmation by the end of the week. I thanked her, though what I really wanted was to laugh. I could picture Karen's face when she read that notice, realizing that her reign as the self-appointed guardian of Maple Ridge Estates had officially ended. Denise's voice softened before she left. "For what it's worth," she said, "that demonstration was brilliant. I think everyone needed to be reminded that kindness and respect matter more than control." After she left, I leaned back in my chair and looked at Max. He was stretched out across the porch, eyes half closed, perfectly at peace. The setting sun cast long golden lines across his fur, and for a moment, everything felt right again. The tension that had hung over our house for weeks seemed to dissolve into the warm evening air. The neighborhood was finally quiet, not the uneasy kind of quiet that comes from fear, but the comfortable quiet of normal life returning. Over the next few days, word spread quickly about Karen's downfall. Some of the neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves properly, bringing over cookies or coffee as peace offerings. They talked about how tired they had been of her constant interference, but hadn't known how to stop it. The K9 demonstration had given them something undeniable to talk about, something that broke her illusion of authority. Even the mailman, who had once avoided my street, started whistling when he dropped off the mail again. It was like the entire block had taken a collective breath of relief. Karen, on the other hand, became something of a ghost. Her blinds stayed shut, her car disappeared for long stretches, and the only sign of life from her house was the occasional rustle of curtains when Max and I walked past. She no longer shouted, no longer wrote notes, no longer tried to document my every move. The silence from her direction was almost unsettling at first, like the calm after a storm. But then I realized it wasn't silence at all, it was defeat. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I took Max for our usual walk. When we passed Karen's house, he stopped for a moment and looked toward her window. His ears perked up, and he gave a single short bark before continuing down the sidewalk. It wasn't loud or threatening, just a statement, a kind of farewell from one guardian to another who had forgotten what protection really meant. That small bark felt like closure. Karen had tried to make herself the law, and the law had answered in the form of 100 canine seconds sitting in perfect formation on her street. Max and I kept walking, the rhythm of his paws steady and confident, the night soft and still around us. I realized then that sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom or through arguments. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried on 4 paws and a wagging tail, reminding everyone that peace is strongest when you stop fighting for control and start living with respect. And that, my friends, is how one HOA Karen learned that barking up the wrong tree can unleash a whole pack of consequences. If you've ever had a neighbor who mistook their clipboard for a badge, hit that subscribe button for more stories where karma wears a uniform. Drop a comment with your wildest HOA encounters. Trust me, I read them all. And some of you are living sitcoms. Remember, a good neighbor minds their own business, but a great one keeps receipts. Until next time, may your dogs be loyal, your fences be tall, and your Karens stay far, far away.